Her pressure is dropping. We need her stabilized now.
Maya Whitfield had been awake for 31 hours when the social worker walked into her hospital room holding a folder with her name on it. Her body was still trembling from the epidural wearing off, her arms too weak to lift, her chest raw from a surgery she barely remembered ending. Her newborn triplets were somewhere down the hall in incubators she had not been allowed to see yet, and standing at the foot of her bed, arms crossed, was her husband Julian Cross, dressed for court rather than for fatherhood. The social worker cleared her throat and read from the folder. Based on statements provided by your husband and a licensed evaluator, there are concerns regarding your mental fitness to retain custody. Maya opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Julian would not meet her eyes, and the last thing she heard before the room tilted sideways was the social worker saying the words, "Temporary emergency hold." Before we go further into how Maya ended up here, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 6 years earlier, Maya Whitfield was the kind of woman people trusted without knowing why. She worked as a labor and delivery nurse at a public hospital in Cleveland, the kind of hospital that ran short on supplies but never short on mothers who needed someone steady beside them. She had grown up in a house where steady was rare. Her mother raised her alone after her father left when Maya was 9, disappearing into a life that never included a single birthday card. Maya learned early that people you loved could vanish without warning, and that the only thing she could control was how hard she worked. She poured that discipline into nursing school, graduating at the top of her class while working 2 jobs to pay for it, and by the time she stepped onto the maternity floor for her first shift, she already understood what it meant to hold someone up when they had nothing left to hold themselves with. She met Julian Cross on a night that should have been unremarkable. He had come to the hospital to sit with a colleague whose wife was delivering early, pacing the family waiting room in an expensive coat that did not belong in a public hospital hallway. Maya walked past him twice before he said anything, and when he finally spoke, it was not a pickup line. It was a genuine question about whether the baby down the hall was going to be all right. She liked that he asked before he flirted. He liked that she answered honestly, instead of offering comfort she could not promise. 3 months later they were inseparable, and within a year they were married in a small ceremony that Maya's mother cried through from start to finish. Julian was ambitious, sharp, and already climbing fast inside a private equity firm on the east side of the city. Maya believed, the way people in love often do, that ambition and cruelty were different things. For the first 2 years they were. Julian came home late, but he came home. He complained about his firm's culture, but he never brought that coldness into their apartment. He used to sit on their second-hand couch and listen to Maya talk about her shifts, about the mothers who scared her and the ones who inspired her, and he would tell her that her work mattered more than anything happening on the 41st floor of his office building. Maya believed him. She did not notice, not at first, the way his praise started shifting from admiration to comparison, the way he began mentioning his co-workers' wives who did not work 12-hour shifts, who did not come home smelling like a hospital, who could attend his firm's events without falling asleep in the car on the way home. She thought it was stress. She did not yet understand that stress in some people simply reveals what was underneath the whole time. The cracks widened when Julian made partner. The promotion changed the version of him that Maya had married. Not overnight, but steadily, the way a house settles before anyone notices the foundation shifting. He started requesting she skip shifts to attend dinners with clients, then criticizing her when she could not. He told her once, almost casually, that a nurse's income was starting to look like an accessory rather than a contribution. She laughed it off the first time. The second time, it did not feel like a joke. And when Maya found out she was pregnant, not with 1 child but with triplets, she expected the news to soften him, to remind him of the life they had built together before ambition swallowed it. Instead, Julian sat across from her at their kitchen table, silent for nearly a full minute, before saying the words that would echo through every conversation that followed. That is going to complicate things. Maya told herself complicate did not mean unwanted. She held on to that distinction through months of a high-risk pregnancy that required more rest than her job allowed and more support than her husband provided. She worked reduced shifts, then medical leave, watching her savings account shrink while Julian's client dinners grew more frequent and his hours at home grew shorter. She noticed, though she tried not to let herself notice fully, the name that kept appearing in his calendar invites and text notifications. Simone Delacroix, a senior associate at his firm, sharp-featured and perpetually composed, the kind of woman who made Maya feel like she was still wearing scrubs even when she had changed. Simone had once shaken Maya's hand at a holiday party and said, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, that Julian talked about her constantly. Maya did not know yet that Simone meant something entirely different by that sentence than the one Maya heard. By the 7th month of her pregnancy, Maya's body was fighting to keep 3 lives growing inside her, and her marriage was fighting to survive it all. Julian had started sleeping in the guest room, citing her restlessness, though Maya suspected the truth had less to do with sleep and more to do with distance he was choosing on purpose. She spent her nights alone, hand resting on her stomach, whispering promises to 3 heartbeats that she refused to break no matter what happened between her and their father. She thought about her own childhood, about a father who disappeared, and she made a vow that her children would never wonder if they had been wanted. She did not know that somewhere across the city, in a firm office on the 41st floor, a plan was already forming that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with what Julian stood to lose if 3 children entered his life at the wrong moment in his career. The night Maya went into labor was the coldest night Cleveland had seen in a decade. Contractions hit hard and early, 6 weeks ahead of her due date, and she called Julian 4 times before he answered, his voice thick with the noise of a restaurant behind him. He told her he would meet her there, but by the time Maya arrived at the hospital alone, shaking, gripping the passenger seat of a rideshare car because she could not trust her own hands to drive, Julian was still 40 minutes away. The delivery came fast and violent. Complications stacking on complications. Blood pressure crashing twice before the surgical team stabilized her enough to proceed. Maya remembers fragments. A mask over her face. A voice telling her to stay awake. And somewhere in the chaos, a signature being requested on forms she never saw, because a decision had already been made about how this night would be remembered by the man who was supposed to be standing beside her. When Maya woke from surgery, groggy and disoriented, the first face she saw was not Julian's. It was a hospital social worker, standing at the foot of her bed with a folder in her hands and an expression that made Maya's stomach drop before a single word was spoken. Julian stood near the window, arms folded, his face arranged into something between concern and detachment that Maya would later understand was rehearsed. The social worker explained, in the careful language people use when delivering something they know will shatter a room, that a formal concern had been raised regarding Maya's mental fitness to care for the newborns. Maya's mouth went dry. She asked who had raised the concern. The social worker glanced at Julian before answering, and in that glance Maya understood everything she needed to know about where this had started. Julian's accusation, once Maya forced him to say it aloud, centered on an incident from 4 months earlier that Maya barely remembered happening the way he described it. She had experienced a panic episode during a particularly frightening prenatal appointment, crying in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes after a doctor mentioned possible complications with one of the triplets. Julian had been there that day, had comforted her in the moment, had told her it was completely understandable given the stress she was under. Now, months later, that same moment had been reshaped into evidence. He told the evaluator Maya experienced regular emotional instability. He told them she had grown paranoid, accusing him of things that were not true, referring to the very real suspicions Maya had voiced about Simone. He had taken every fear Maya carried and repackaged it as proof that she could not be trusted with her own children. Maya tried to explain herself to the social worker, her voice cracking from exhaustion and disbelief. But exhaustion did not read well on paper, and neither did anger, and both were being used against her in that room. The social worker explained that under the emergency provisions being invoked, the newborns would remain under expanded hospital supervision while an investigation proceeded, and that Maya's contact with them would be limited to supervised visits until a formal hearing could take place. Maya felt something break inside her chest that had nothing to do with the surgical incision still healing beneath her hospital gown. She looked at Julian, searching his face for even a flicker of the man she had married, and found nothing there but calculation. It was in that silence, staring at a husband who would not defend her, that Maya understood she was now fighting a war she had not known was being planned. The first person to walk back into that room and refuse to accept what was happening was not a lawyer. It was Dr. Elliot Bryant, the attending physician who had spent the entire night stabilizing Maya through 2 blood pressure crashes and a surgical complication that nearly cost her life. He had reviewed her full medical history before the delivery, had spoken with her at length during prenatal consultations, and none of what he knew about Maya matched the picture being painted in that folder. He requested to speak privately with the hospital's ethics board, citing concerns about the timing and origin of the fitness complaint. He was careful, measured, professional in every word he chose. But underneath that professionalism was a steady, quiet fury at watching a woman who had nearly died protecting her children get treated like a danger to them instead. Elliot's intervention bought Maya something she desperately needed, which was time. The hospital agreed to pause the expanded supervision pending a full clinical evaluation rather than accepting Julian's claims at face value. Maya spent that first day in a haze of fear and gratitude, watching through a nursery window as nurses cared for 3 babies she was only allowed to see for 15 minutes at a stretch. She named them quietly to herself before she was permitted to name them officially. Amara, for the mother she wished she had been strong enough to protect. Isaiah, for the father figure she never had but always wished existed. And Noah, the smallest of the 3, the one whose lungs needed the most help, the one Maya prayed over every single time she was allowed near his incubator. She refused to let herself imagine losing them. She could not afford to. Elliot found Maya on her second night in the recovery wing, sitting upright despite doctor's orders, staring at nothing. He sat down without asking permission, the way people do when they already sense someone needs company more than solitude. He told her plainly that nothing in her chart, her behavior, or her history supported what Julian had claimed. He told her the panic episode she had 4 months earlier was a documented and entirely normal response to frightening medical news, not evidence of instability. Maya asked him why he was helping her. He said simply that he had watched her fight to stay alive for 3 children who did not yet have names, and that fighting like that was not something an unfit mother did. It was the first time in days that Maya let herself cry without trying to hide it, and Elliot did not look away while she did. The formal evaluation was scheduled for the following week, conducted by an independent psychiatrist assigned through the hospital rather than one selected by either party. Maya spent the days leading up to it, terrified that exhaustion and grief would somehow be misread as the instability Julian had described. Her attorney, a family law specialist named Renata Osei, who took the case after Elliot personally recommended her, warned Maya that these evaluations could be unpredictable, shaped as much by presentation as by fact. Maya practiced staying calm in the mirror of her hospital bathroom, practiced explaining her fears about Simone without sounding paranoid, practiced answering questions about her childhood without sounding damaged beyond repair. She hated that she had to perform stability to prove she already had it, but she understood that in rooms built by people like Julian, perception often outweighed truth, and she intended to win regardless of which currency the fight required. The evaluation itself lasted 3 hours. Maya answered every question honestly, describing her nursing career, her relationship with her own mother, the fear she had felt watching her blood pressure crash on the delivery table, the anger she felt at Julian's absence that night. The psychiatrist asked pointed questions about the panic episode from months earlier, and Maya explained it exactly as it happened, a frightened, expectant mother crying after receiving frightening medical news, comforted at the time by the very husband who was now using it against her. When the evaluation ended, the psychiatrist told Maya nothing about the outcome, only that a report would be filed with the court. Maya walked back to her room, feeling as though she had just taken an exam, with no idea whether she had passed, holding on to nothing but the memory of Elliot's certainty that the truth would hold if given the chance to be heard. While Maya waited for results, Renata began building a case that reached far beyond the fitness complaint itself. Her first move was the least glamorous part of any investigation, a formal request for phone records, calendar logs, and financial statements connected to Julian's firm, filed through channels that would take days to answer and might return nothing useful at all. Renata warned Maya not to expect quick answers. Custody investigations, she explained, usually lived or died on paperwork nobody wanted to read, buried timestamps and forwarded emails that meant nothing on their own until someone had the patience to line them up beside each other. Maya nodded and said she had patience. What she did not say was that patience felt like the only thing she had left, since everything else, her marriage, her sense of safety, her ability to trust her own judgment, had already been taken from her one document at a time. The first week of the investigation produced almost nothing. Renata's paralegal, a meticulous young man named Desmond who had a habit of reading contracts twice before ever speaking about them, spent 4 days cross-referencing Julian's calendar invites against Maya's own memory of events, searching for any meeting that predated the fitness complaint being filed. He found a handful of vague entries labeled only with initials, SD, appearing far more often than any other set of letters on Julian's schedule, but initials alone proved nothing in a courtroom. Renata reminded Maya more than once that suspicion was not evidence, that judges did not rule on patterns of feeling, only on documents that could be placed directly in front of them and defended under cross-examination. Maya spent those first days oscillating between hope and a familiar, exhausting despair, watching her children through a nursery window while strangers searched for proof of something she already knew in her bones to be true. The break came almost by accident, the way many of the most important discoveries in a case tend to. Desmond had requested, as a matter of routine thoroughness rather than any specific suspicion, the sign-in logs from the private evaluator's office that Julian had initially attempted to hire before the hospital intervened and required an independent assessment instead. Those logs, obtained through a subpoena that nearly stalled twice over jurisdictional objections from Julian's attorney, showed something Renata had not expected to find so cleanly documented. Simone Delacroix's name appeared 3 separate times, signed in alongside Julian, at meetings that occurred weeks before any formal fitness complaint had been filed with the hospital. This was not a woman offering casual advice to a stressed colleague after the fact. This was a woman physically present in the room while a strategy was being assembled, long before Maya had even given birth. Renata called Maya into her office the evening those logs arrived, and Maya remembers sitting across the desk feeling her pulse rise before a single detail had even been explained to her, some older part of her nervous system recognizing the shape of bad news before her conscious mind caught up. Renata laid the sign-in sheets side by side and walked Maya through the dates, watching her client's face carefully as the timeline settled into place. Maya sat very still, doing the math in her head, matching those meeting dates against her own memory of the final months of her pregnancy, remembering specific evenings Julian had claimed to be working late, remembering how relieved she had felt believing exhaustion alone explained his distance. It had not been exhaustion, it had been planning. Maya asked Renata quietly whether this meant Julian had decided to take her children from her before they had even been born, and Renata, choosing her words with visible care, said the evidence certainly pointed that direction. The sign-in logs alone were not enough to build a full case, so Renata's team moved next toward Julian's firm itself, requesting internal communications through a subpoena that his employer's legal department fought for nearly 2 weeks before a judge ordered limited compliance. The firm produced a narrow set of emails, heavily redacted at first, forcing Renata to file a second motion, specifically challenging the scope of the redactions, as overly broad given the custody matter at stake. Maya sat through this stretch of the investigation, feeling almost as helpless as she had in the hospital room, watching lawyers argue over paperwork while her children grew another week older in a life still shadowed by uncertainty. Desmond kept a running log taped to the office wall, tracking every request filed and every deadline the firm missed, and Maya found herself checking that log the way other people check a weather forecast, searching daily for some small sign that the storm might finally be breaking in her favor. When the firm's second, less redacted production finally arrived, Renata spent an entire weekend reading through nearly 400 pages of internal correspondence, most of it unrelated financial noise, the ordinary churn of a private equity office discussing deals that had nothing to do with Maya's case. But buried in the middle of that noise was a single email chain that changed everything. Simone had written to Julian directly, in language careful enough to avoid explicit admission, but clear enough in context to be devastating once read beside everything else Renata had already assembled. The email discussed which specific incidents from Maya's pregnancy would, in Simone's words, translate most effectively for an evaluator unfamiliar with the full picture. It suggested emphasizing Maya's tears rather than the medical news that had caused them. It suggested describing Maya's questions about Simone's role in the firm as evidence of paranoia rather than reasonable suspicion. Renata read that email 3 times before calling Maya at nearly midnight to tell her what she had found. Maya asked to see the email herself rather than simply hearing it described, and Renata brought her into the office the following morning to read it in full. Maya sat with the printed page in her hands for a long time before saying anything, feeling something shift inside her chest that was not quite relief and not quite rage, but some exhausted combination of both. She recognized her own words in that email, twisted carefully into something unrecognizable. Her fear reshaped into instability. Her grief reshaped into evidence against her. She asked Renata how someone could write something like this so plainly, so confidently, apparently untroubled by what it would mean for 3 newborn children to lose their mother over a strategy session conducted between 2 adults protecting their own interests. Renata did not have a comforting answer for that question. She simply said that some people convinced themselves the ends justified the means long before they ever had to look the consequences in the face. The investigation still had one significant gap, since firm emails alone could suggest coordination, but did not conclusively prove Julian had acted on Simone's specific guidance rather than his own independent judgment. A distinction his attorney would certainly try to exploit at the hearing. Renata's team spent the following days attempting to locate any direct communication between Julian and Simone outside of firm channels. Aware that people engaged in this kind of coordination rarely limited themselves to messages that could be discovered through a subpoena of corporate email servers. Desmond reached out, through entirely legal channels, to a former analyst who had recently left the firm on bad terms and was rumored to have kept copies of internal communications as leverage during a separate dispute over his own severance package. That analyst, after some negotiation, agreed to share what he had, though he warned Renata the material might be incomplete and might not directly implicate anyone beyond confirming office gossip that was already widely known. What the former analyst provided turned out to be more valuable than anyone expected, a personal voicemail that had been forwarded and saved almost as an afterthought months earlier, back when the analyst still worked closely enough with Julian to be looped into casual conversations about his personal life. The voicemail had originally been left by Simone for Julian, then accidentally forwarded to an old shared contact during a mass calendar sync error that Julian's own assistant later confirmed under separate questioning. In the recording, Simone's voice was calm, businesslike, almost clinical in the way she outlined timing considerations for the fitness complaint, explaining that filing immediately after delivery would create maximum leverage before Maya had physically recovered enough to mount an effective response. Renata played the recording for Maya only once, watching her client's hands tighten into fists as she listened to a stranger calculate her vulnerability with the same tone someone might use to discuss quarterly projections. With the voicemail secured and authenticated, Renata assembled the full case into a single, chronological narrative designed to leave no room for ambiguity once presented in court. The sign-in logs established that Simone had been present during the earliest strategic meetings, weeks before any formal complaint existed. The email chain established the specific language Simone had crafted for Julian to use, language that appeared nearly verbatim in the eventual complaint filed against Maya. The voicemail established explicit, calculated timing, proving the complaint had been designed around Maya's physical vulnerability, rather than any genuine concern for the children's welfare. Renata explained to Maya that judges saw manipulative custody claims often enough to be skeptical by default, but rarely encountered a case with this much direct, undeniable documentation connecting every stage of the plan back to its architect. For the first time since waking up in that hospital room to a folder with her name on it, Maya allowed herself to believe the truth might actually be enough. Renata's discovery forced a difficult conversation with Maya about what Simone actually wanted from all of this. It became clear, piecing together firm gossip, emails, and the timeline of Julian's promotion, that Simone had been positioning herself as Julian's partner both professionally and personally for over a year, using every insecurity he carried about balancing ambition with fatherhood. Simone had convinced Julian, gradually and deliberately, that 3 children would derail the trajectory he had spent his adult life building, that Maya's medical career made her an unsuitable partner for the image his firm expected from senior leadership, and that a fitness complaint filed early enough could resolve the entire situation before public opinion or family courts had time to organize against him. Simone was not simply an affair. She was the architect of a plan to erase Maya from her own family. Learning this should have made Maya feel only rage, and for a while it did, but it also opened a strange and unexpected space for something closer to clarity. She realized that Julian's cruelty was not purely his own invention, that a woman with nothing to lose and everything to gain had spent over a year sharpening every insecurity he carried until he became willing to file a fitness complaint against the mother of his own children. This did not excuse what Julian had done. Maya was clear with herself and with Renata that manipulation did not remove responsibility, and that Julian had signed his name to every document, had spoken every sentence to the evaluator himself, had made the choice to stand silently in a hospital room while his wife's mental health was questioned rather than defending her. But understanding the architecture behind his betrayal gave Maya something to aim at beyond blind anger. It gave her a target for justice rather than only grief. The independent evaluation results arrived 11 days after Maya gave birth, delivered directly to Renata's office, rather than through the hospital social worker this time. The report stated plainly that Maya exhibited no signs of psychiatric instability, no pattern of behavior consistent with impaired judgment, and that the previously cited panic episode represented a normal and medically unremarkable stress response given the circumstances surrounding it. The evaluator further noted, in language Renata would later use directly in court, that several details provided by Julian regarding the timeline and context of past incidents did not match documentation available in Maya's medical records. In plain terms, the evaluator was stating that Julian had lied. Maya read the report twice through tears, sitting beside Noah's incubator, one hand resting gently against the glass separating her from her smallest son. Armed with the evaluation results and the discovery of Simone's coordinated involvement, Renata filed for an emergency hearing to restore Maya's full custody rights and simultaneously filed a countersuit against Julian for malicious use of a fitness complaint, a legal maneuver rarely pursued but devastating when properly documented. The hearing was set for the following week, giving both sides time to prepare, though Maya suspected Julian had far less preparation available to him than he believed. Renata warned Maya that Julian's attorney would likely attempt to shift focus toward Maya's family history, particularly her absent father, in an effort to suggest patterns of instability ran deeper than a single panic episode. Maya spent that week preparing herself emotionally for the possibility that her most painful childhood wound might be dragged into a courtroom and used as ammunition against her. She did not yet know that her father himself was about to re-enter her life in a way no one anticipated. 3 days before the scheduled hearing, Maya received a phone call from a number she did not recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to a man she had not heard speak in over 20 years, a voice roughened by time but unmistakably her father's. Reginald Whitfield had left when Maya was 9 years old, vanishing from her life so completely that she had spent years assuming he was either dead or simply uninterested in confirming otherwise. He explained, haltingly, that he had learned about the triplets through a mutual acquaintance and wanted to reconnect, to be present in his grandchildren's lives in a way he had never managed to be present in his daughter's. Maya's first instinct was to hang up. Her second instinct, quieter but more insistent, was curiosity about why a man who had ignored her for 2 decades had chosen this exact chaotic moment to resurface. Maya agreed to meet Reginald only because Renata suggested it might be useful to understand his intentions before the hearing, given that unexpected family members sometimes complicated custody proceedings in ways attorneys needed advance warning about. The meeting took place in a quiet diner near the hospital, Maya arriving early and watching the door with the same wariness she brought to every difficult conversation lately. When Reginald walked in, older and thinner than she remembered, something in his posture suggested illness rather than simple aging. He confirmed it within minutes of sitting down, explaining that he had been diagnosed with a rare blood disorder requiring a bone marrow transplant, and that biological relatives offered the best chance of a compatible match. He had not returned for Maya. He had returned, at least in part, because his survival depended on genetic material only she and her children could provide. Maya sat across from her father, absorbing 2 decades of absence compressed into a single confession, feeling the old wound reopen even as a new complication layered itself on top. Reginald insisted he wanted a relationship, regardless of the medical circumstances, that his diagnosis had simply accelerated a reconciliation he had been considering for years. Maya wanted to believe him, some small part of her still 9 years old and desperate for a father who stayed, but she had learned enough in recent weeks about people using vulnerable moments for personal gain that she could not fully separate genuine remorse from convenient timing. She told Reginald she needed time to think, that her children were currently the subject of a custody battle that required every ounce of her focus, and that whatever relationship might exist between them would have to wait until her family was safe. He accepted this quietly, though something in his expression suggested he was not entirely willing to wait as patiently as he claimed. The emergency hearing arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, the courtroom smaller and less theatrical than Maya had imagined, filled mostly with attorneys and clerks rather than spectators. Julian sat beside his attorney, looking composed in a tailored suit. Simone notably absent from the courtroom itself, though her fingerprints were all over the documents Renata intended to present. Maya wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back neatly, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. Elliot had offered to attend for support, and though Renata advised against a treating physician appearing too closely aligned with Maya's personal life, Elliot sat quietly in the gallery anyway, present without being asked. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Alvarez, known for her impatience with bad faith litigation, called the hearing to order and asked Renata to present her case first. Renata began by walking the court through the timeline of the fitness complaint, establishing that meetings with an evaluator had occurred weeks before any formal incident had allegedly justified them. She introduced the firm emails showing Simone's direct involvement in coaching Julian's language, drawing an audible reaction from several people in the gallery when she read aloud a message in which Simone advised Julian to emphasize Maya's crying rather than the medical news that caused it. Julian's attorney objected repeatedly, arguing relevance, but Judge Alvarez allowed each piece of evidence, her expression growing increasingly unreadable as the picture assembled itself before her. Renata then introduced the independent evaluation results, reading the psychiatrist's conclusion that no instability existed and that portions of Julian's account did not match Maya's documented medical history. The courtroom grew quiet in the particular way rooms do when everyone present understands a case has just shifted decisively. Julian's attorney attempted damage control by shifting focus toward Maya's family history, exactly as Renata had predicted, questioning whether a childhood marked by parental abandonment might create unconscious patterns relevant to her fitness as a parent. Maya felt her pulse spike, anticipating the moment she had dreaded all week, but Renata was prepared, calmly noting that decades of family court precedent explicitly rejected using a parent's own childhood trauma as evidence against their capacity to parent, and that suggesting otherwise bordered on a separate ethical violation. Judge Alvarez agreed sharply, instructing Julian's attorney to move on or risk sanctions. It was in this moment, watching her attorney defend not just her present but her past, that Maya finally allowed herself to believe she might actually win this fight rather than simply survive it. Julian took the stand next, and under Renata's methodical cross-examination, his composed exterior began to crack in ways Maya had never witnessed during their entire marriage. Renata asked him directly whether Simone Delacroix had suggested he pursue a fitness complaint prior to any specific incident justifying one. Julian hesitated long enough that the hesitation itself became an answer, before eventually admitting that conversations with Simone had influenced his thinking, though he insisted his concerns about Maya were genuine regardless of her involvement. Renata pressed further, asking whether Julian had been physically present for the panic episode he cited as evidence, and whether he recalled comforting Maya at the time rather than expressing concern about her stability. Julian's silence stretched uncomfortably before he finally admitted, quietly, that yes, he remembered comforting her that day. Judge Alvarez made a note that seemed to carry considerable weight. The turning point of the hearing arrived when Renata introduced the final piece of evidence her team had spent weeks securing and authenticating: the recorded voicemail Simone had left for Julian months before the birth, the one the former analyst had quietly preserved and eventually handed over. Julian's attorney had clearly never learned of its existence, and his face shifted the moment Renata announced what she intended to play for the court. In the recording, Simone's voice was unmistakable, coldly outlining exactly how a fitness complaint filed immediately after delivery would create maximum leverage before Maya had recovered enough to fight back effectively. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the recording played, Julian's face draining of color as his own private manipulation became public evidence against him. Judge Alvarez did not bother hiding her disgust, addressing Julian directly to ask how he could have allowed himself to be guided so completely by someone with such transparent motives regarding his own children. Judge Alvarez's ruling, when it came less than an hour after closing arguments, restored Maya's full and immediate custody of all 3 children without restriction, describing the fitness complaint as originating from bad faith rather than genuine concern, and ordering a formal referral for potential legal consequences against both Julian and Simone for their coordinated conduct. Julian's attorney requested a stay pending appeal, but Judge Alvarez denied it outright, stating plainly that she saw no reasonable basis for further delay in reuniting a mother with newborns who had already spent too many days separated from her over an accusation built entirely on manipulation rather than truth. Maya sat frozen for a moment, unable to fully process the ruling, until Renata squeezed her hand and told her quietly that it was over, that she had won, that her children were coming home. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon felt unlike anything Maya had experienced before. Sunlight breaking through gray clouds in a way that felt almost deliberately symbolic. Elliot walked beside her, not saying much, simply present in the way he had been present throughout the entire ordeal. Steady, without demanding attention for his steadiness. Renata handed Maya paperwork, confirming immediate discharge clearance for the triplets, explaining that hospital staff had already been notified and that Amara, Isaiah, and Noah could go home with their mother that same evening. Maya laughed and cried simultaneously, an exhausted, overwhelmed sound that surprised even her, and Elliot reached out to steady her when her knees briefly threatened to give out beneath the weight of relief, finally allowed to land after weeks of holding herself upright through sheer force of will. The following weeks brought a strange, quiet aftermath, the kind that arrives after a storm rather than during one. Julian was placed on administrative leave from his firm, pending an internal investigation into the ethics of his conduct, and Simone was quietly terminated once the recorded voicemail became known throughout the firm's leadership. Maya learned through mutual acquaintances that Julian had attempted to reach out several times in the weeks following the ruling, though she declined every call, unwilling to reopen a door that had cost her so much to finally close. She focused instead on her children, on the quiet, ordinary miracle of feeding 3 infants at 3 in the morning, without fear of a knock at the door, without fear of a folder with her name on it, without fear that loving her children too visibly might somehow be used as evidence against her. Reginald reached out again a month after the hearing, and this time Maya agreed to see him with clearer eyes than before, understanding both his genuine desire for connection and the medical urgency that had brought him back into her life in the first place. She agreed to genetic testing for potential bone marrow compatibility, not because she owed him anything, but because she had decided she did not want to become a person who let old wounds dictate every future choice, even when those wounds were fully justified. The testing confirmed a partial match through Maya herself rather than the children, a discovery that led to a complicated but ultimately manageable treatment path for Reginald's condition. Their relationship remained careful, bounded by 2 decades of absence that could not simply be erased. But it existed, tentative and honest, built on truth rather than the desperate performance he had first offered her. Elliot remained a quiet constant throughout that entire recovery, visiting not as a physician checking on a former patient but as a friend who had watched Maya fight for everything she loved and wanted to remain part of whatever came next. Their relationship developed slowly, without urgency, built on the kind of steady trust that neither of them had experienced in a long time. Maya was careful with her heart in a way she had not been careful before Julian, unwilling to hand it over without evidence that it would be protected rather than exploited. Elliot never asked her to move faster than she was ready for, never pushed for more than she offered, content simply to be present in the ordinary moments, holding one of the triplets while Maya finally slept through an uninterrupted night, learning each child's particular cries well enough to know which one needed him, without Maya having to say a word. One evening, nearly 6 months after the hearing, Maya sat on her back porch watching Amara, Isaiah, and Noah sleeping peacefully in a shared nursery just visible through the window behind her. 3 heartbeats she had once prayed over, through incubator glass, now breathing steadily in their own home. Elliot sat beside her, quiet in the way he always was, and Maya found herself thinking about the version of herself who had woken from surgery to find a folder with her name on it, who had been told the word unfit as though it could be true simply because someone with power decided to say it aloud. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything to a lie built by 2 people who mistook cruelty for strategy, and how far she had traveled since that hospital room to a porch where safety no longer felt like something she had to fight for every single day. So if you made it this far with me, I want you to sit with something for a moment. Somewhere out there tonight, someone is being told they are unfit, unworthy, incapable, simply because admitting the truth would be inconvenient for someone else. Maya's story is proof that a lie built with enough confidence can still collapse the moment it meets real evidence and real courage. You are allowed to fight for what is true, even when the people around you have already decided the outcome. You are allowed to rebuild trust slowly, on your own terms, after it has been broken by people who never deserved it in the first place. If this story meant something to you tonight, share it with someone who needs to hear that their fight is not over yet, and I will see you in the next one.